Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this, I can't remember, seventh or eighth edition of our webinars on the findings of the Deaton Review of Inequalities. I'm really pleased today that we are looking at something that's really very central, obviously, to understanding what's happening to inequality in the UK, and that's what's happening in the labour market. We've got four fantastic speakers. We're kicking off with Rob Joyce, who's the Deputy Director here at the IFS, and we'll be talking about some work he's been doing with colleagues looking at the relative roles of what's been happening in the labour market and what's been happening to benefit policy, and in particular the trade-off in some ways between tax credits and minimum wages, and explaining what's been happening to inequality. Steve Machin, who's a professor at the LSE and director of the Centre for Economic Performance, and is the author of the main chapter in the review on labour markets, or one of the authors with Julia Giapponi, will be talking about what's been happening more broadly to earnings and wage inequality over the last 40 years, and talking a little about some of the policy implications of that. Then we're really pleased to have Kate Bell from the TUC, who will be talking about inequality in the labour market from their perspective. And finally, Richard Blundell, Research Director at the IFS and member of the panel for the Deaton Review, and indeed one of the moving forces behind all of this work happening, who will try to summarize what has been a very large amount of work which has gone into the review on the labour market. Between them, I hope they'll take a little bit less than an hour, and then we will have plenty of time for questions, which you can provide via the Slido app, which you'll have access to. And if you see questions on there that you like, do boot them up, because then I will see them more easily. And finally, just to say many thanks, as ever, to the Nuffield Foundation for very generously funding this enormous and incredibly important initiative. With that, I will disappear. I'll hand over to Rob, and then you won't see me again until Rob, Steve, Kate, and Richard have finished speaking.
Thanks very much, Paul. Well, as Paul said, I'm going to speak. Should make sure my slides are operating as they should. Okay, so as Paul said, I'm going to speak first, really just very briefly, and I see this as mostly helping to set up what Steve will talk about, because essentially Steve will talk about some very in-depth work that he and Julia Giapponi have been doing, looking at what's been happening to individuals' labour market outcomes and prospects over recent history in Britain. What I'm going to try to show you is just how crucial that is once you put it all together in determining households' living standards. For the vast majority of households, perhaps not so many of those at the very, very top, who for data-related reasons won't be such a focus of what I'll be talking about, and will be more of a focus of other work later in the review. For the vast majority of households, if you put together what's happening to earnings within that household and what's happening to essentially redistributive policy, so the taxes they're paying and the transfers they're receiving, that is largely determining what's happening to their total incomes, which in turn is, of course, a huge part of what shapes their material standards of living. And I'm going to show you, try to show you a little bit of that here with respect to the last 25 years in Britain as the kind of case study. So let me show you this starting graph. I'll spend a little bit of time just making sure that we're all clear what this shows you, because it's I'll show you pictures of a similar kind of form a few times throughout this talk. So this is trying to display changes in household labour income. So all the income that households get from employment or self-employment. And it's showing you changes across the distribution of that measure of resources of household labour income, from lowest income on the left to highest on the right. So taking all people who were in a working household in 1994, first of all, So working household here, just a shorthand for a household with at least one adult in paid work. And at each point in the distribution, looking at how much that household was earning, and then doing exactly the same thing for those households who were in work in 2011, and taking the difference and showing you the change at each point in the distribution. So the fact that this line slopes upward shows you immediately that inequality in household labour income over this period among working households was increasing quite notably over that period. Now, this is all among working households only, so this is ignoring the fact that, and I'll come back to this explicitly towards the end because it's very important, ignoring the fact that the number of working households was increasing over this period. So that was helping to boost income, and that's not shown here. But in terms of patterns of earnings among households, you can see a pretty clear and inequality increasing pattern here. What happened in roughly the last decade, this is essentially the period between the two crises. 2011 is about when earnings in a very stuttering way began to grow again in the economy as a whole after the financial crisis. 2019 is the last data point before the pandemic. And here we see a completely opposite pattern. Household earnings inequalities actually started falling. So all else being equal, for anyone who wants to see reduced inequalities, this looks like a much more favourable sort of underlying picture to be starting with this reduction in household earnings inequalities. And to very briefly, I won't do this at any length at all because it's more starting to overlap with what Steve will do in much more detail. But very briefly, why do we see this? Why do we see household labour income inequality increasing and then falling in a really a mirror image between these two periods? I would break it down essentially into two main factors when it comes to what was happening to individuals' labour market outcomes. One is that hourly wage inequality patterns change. So over that prior period, which I've got on the left-hand side, and now showing you changes in individuals' hourly wages, so quite different from their household total labour income, just individuals now hourly wages by percentile of hourly wages. Here you can see that in that first period, hourly wage inequality for both men and women was either flat and pretty much exactly flat in the bottom half of those distributions, or increasing, and particularly clearly increasing in the top half of the distribution for men. Whereas if we look at that latter period, very, very clear and very different picture, for the most part at least, of falling wage inequality with significantly higher wage growth at the bottom. It ticks up again once you get into the top 20% or so, although even there, it doesn't quite get to the heights that we see right at the very bottom. And we know that at least part of this is because of big increases in the minimum wage. Certainly within the bottom quarter or so of the distribution, where you see the biggest growth here, we know from other work that's looked at that more rigorously that a lot of that is to do with big increases in the minimum wage, which of course Steve will talk about more. And the second factor that changed, which produced that very different pattern of changes in household earnings inequalities in the latter period, is this one, is what was happening to hours of work. Of course, when you're looking at someone's earnings, changes there can depend both on what's happening to hourly wages, but also how many hours they're working. And one pattern that we were seeing in that earlier period, which from the point of view of trying to contain earnings inequalities was very unhelpful, was that and this was a trend specific to men, by the way, you didn't see this amongst women, but those men with the lowest hourly wages were also seeing falls in hours of work, so dragging down earnings even further towards the bottom. And you can see that here. So this green line takes men in the bottom quintile of hourly wages and shows you the fraction working part-time, and it was rising almost continuously for that period. But that rise stopped exactly around the 2011 sort of turning point that I'm using in this talk. And the reasons for all of this are perhaps partly understood, but not fully understood, and would be a very good topic for more work, because this was a pretty important pattern in pushing up inequalities in that prior period, and it stopped just as our hourly wage inequalities were also starting to fall, as you saw. So back to this picture of, from a household view, very, very contrasting trends in households' labour income among working households. So I say much more helpful in this latter period if you're someone who wants to see reduced income inequalities. This starting point of reduced labour income inequalities looks very promising. But what happened then to the incomes of these households? So sticking still with the same households for now, so just those working households to make the comparison cleaner. But as I said, I will bring in the impacts of rises in employment as well in just a moment. So I've just taken the picture I showed you on the previous slide. So this picture here, let's split those lines up, put them side by side instead. Exactly the same data. So changes in pre-tax household labour income across the distribution in both periods. And now in both periods, add on another line, which does the same analysis for the same sets of households, but looking at their total income net of tax. And in particular, including now transfer income, so tax credits. Given these are working households, a really key thing here is the inclusion of tax credits. And what you see now is, again, at least within the bottom half, something very much like a mirror image in the two periods. Actually, if you look at total incomes, in that first period, they were growing much, much more healthily towards the bottom than labour incomes were. And that reflects, in particular, huge increases in the generosity of state support for low-earning working households, particularly through the tax credit system, which was significantly expanded, particularly in the late 90s and early 2000s. So really keeping it from an inequality perspective as well, really keeping a lid on inequalities in incomes here, as you can see. On the right-hand side, the opposite happens. So suddenly the underlying picture in terms of earnings inequalities starts looking much more favorable for anyone who wants to see reduced inequalities. They're now having to they're swimming with the tide rather than against the tide. But at just that moment, of course, this is the period of austerity, essentially, and actually tax credits and other forms of state support were being cut back at just this moment. So we see the opposite pattern, where underlying inequality in earnings was going down, but inequality in total incomes was not. And within that bottom half of the distribution, it was in fact rising. Last point I will make is about employment, because this was increasing a lot over much of this period, as you can see here. So what this picture shows you, again, taking the household view, which is what I'm intending to do in this particular talk. This is showing you the percentage of working age adults whose household contains no one in paid work. And here we see a really big reduction from about 17% to 11% over this period, and almost continual reduction other than a bit of a blip during the financial crisis. So that's, to put it another way, for every 3 adults in a workplace household in 1994, there were only 2 of them in 2019. So a reduction of well over 35% essentially. So that's a big change. And nothing I've shown you so far accounts for that. And it may even be that some of those earnings pictures, particularly for showing you what was happening to earnings at the bottom, were perhaps a bit misleadingly negative, because they're not including the fact that some households are moving into work and gaining earnings. And in fact, some of those households may be appearing to drag down earnings figures at the bottom if they're coming into the labour market on low earnings. But of course, they're still earning more than they were before, given they were earning zero before. So I want to show you some analysis which includes the impact of employment growth as well. The simplest way of doing that is just to look at all working age households, not just those in work. And what I'm going to zero in on here is the contribution of labour income, so that same measure of employment income again, to growth in total income. Okay, so that's basically the change in labour income divided by the initial level of total income. That tells you the contribution that it's making to overall growth in incomes, again in the 2 periods. And here you can see more robust growth in the bottom. This is all for the bottom 5th of the income distribution. So you can see more robust growth now in that prior period than we saw before, because we are including the impact of a lot of employment growth. In the latter period, again, if anything, still more positive, because not only did we see continued employment growth, but we also saw much more earnings growth among those in work, as we saw. But again, once we include the impact of redistributive policy, the picture rather flips around. So the red chunk here shows you the contribution of changes to benefit and tax credit incomes, which was positive in that prior period, even though employment was increasing, which tends to mean that households can lose benefit income But despite that, because of the increases in generosity, overall there was further upward pressure on income coming from benefits, but downward pressure, quite a lot of it, in that latter period during austerity. So we've gone from a situation where, again, for that bottom fifth of households, the underlying picture in terms of what was happening to their earnings looked, if anything, a little more favorable in that latter period, but their actual level of income growth, given by the total, the black square here, was considerably lower in that latter period. And similarly, if we're thinking about inequality, if you're comparing the growth they were seeing to the income growth we were seeing for middle income households, which is basically the same in both periods, marked on here by the green dotted dashed line. Again, we went from a situation where income growth is actually somewhat higher at the bottom to one where it was significantly lower at the bottom and in the middle. So that, I think, is quite enough for me. To conclude, hopefully I've convinced you a little bit that, if you needed any convincing, which you perhaps didn't, that labour market trends are absolutely critical to trends, not only in overall living standards, but also in inequalities. We've lent very heavily on two different tools at different times over the past quarter century or so to influence or to offset some of these trends. Firstly, tax credits, which were lent on very heavily in the late 90s and early 2000s, and then more recently, as Steve, I think, will talk about a little bit more, the minimum wage. But just as we've done that, that's been offset by cutbacks to state support, which have actually dragged down overall incomes at the bottom. And the other factor that's been very, very important in boosting incomes is employment growth. On a scale that we very likely cannot rely on again, by the way, over the next 25 years. There's only so much fruit that one can pick there. So I think perhaps one conclusion is that there are two policies which have had big effects and have done a lot of what was asked of them. But they probably can't continue carrying the can on their own, even if we're just thinking about the bottom of the distribution. There's only so far those things can be pushed. And of course, there are also many people who are not helped by those policies. So I think that's one thing that comes out of this, is the need to look to use these tools, but also to really try to find other ways of supporting earnings. But I will stop there and hand over to Steve to present his chapter.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Oops. Okay. Okay, so thanks, Rob. So I want to talk about the chapter that we've written on labour market inequality in the UK for the Deaton Review. It's written by myself and Julia Gipponi. So the kind of context, which has actually been set quite well already by Rob's initial presentation, is that, you know, the economic landscape of the UK labour market is very different now to what it was some 40 years ago. And there's various dimensions of this. I think it's important to take this 40-year perspective because quite a lot has changed, and quite a lot has changed in different dimensions in different time periods as well. So wages have become significantly more unequal. Employment, actually just prior to the pandemic, employment reached record levels. Yet in the last 10, 12 years, the wages of most workers have stagnated in real terms. You may have seen the numbers that have come out this morning, showing real wages are falling again. The composition over this time period, the composition of work has significantly altered, and the role played by different labour market institutions has also changed. So I guess it's quite important that some of this is some of what's been going on in the UK is happening elsewhere in the world, and some is specific. And in this, the kind of response that occurs to global and local economic shocks are important. So what I want to do here is just take a fairly quick fire run through some of the material. There's a lot of it for people who want to read the chapter. There's a lot in there, and I can't possibly cover all of it. But I want to take you through some of the kind of key findings that are reported, and then talk about some of the policy issues, which I think the following two speakers, Kate and Richard, are going to talk about as well. Okay, so the structure of a chapter that we've written highlights the facts about the changing nature of the labour market inequality. It has a section on how well conventional economic models are at explaining the patterns of change. It talks about the role of labour market institutions, and it talks about policy aspects of labour market change. So here I'm going to focus on 3 of these and just briefly talk about the second one. So I would point you towards the chapter if you want to see more detail on that. Okay, so on the first, what we do is we highlight various facts about the labour market, both on the wage side of things and on the employment and hours sides of things. So the key kind of findings that are highlighted, and I'll show you some charts and tables on these as we go through, is that wage inequality, the gap between the highest and the lowest paid workers in the labour market, is significantly higher, and a lot higher than it was some 40 years ago, when inequality started to rise at the end of the 1970s, start of the 1980s. And in this process, the UK has moved up to being one of the higher earnings and equality countries in the developed world. It's got up faster than in many other places. And so therefore the UK has kind of moved up to be higher in the cross-country distribution. This 40-year perspective is very important. There's very clearly different things going on in different decades. In some time periods, inequality rises almost everywhere. In others, only some dimensions of inequality go up, and indeed more recently, actually, as Rob highlighted, and I will highlight again, some parts of the distribution have been becoming more equal in the last 10, 15 years. Another key factor that's occurred and has actually become a persistent phenomenon has been the real slowdown of real wage growth, as real wages have stagnated and actually fallen in some years. So it's actually living standards are obviously falling as real wages fall. And so I'll talk about those. So what key chart is this? This shows you, Rob already introduced the idea about different points of distribution. This shows you wage growth between 1980 and 2019 at 3 points of the wage distribution. The top end, the 90th percentile, that's somebody who's 10% away from the top. The middle person in the labour market, the 50th percentile, and somebody 10% from the bottom. So you see this fanning out of wage growth, and so this corresponds to inequality rising rapidly. If you start to look a little bit more closely at this chart, you can see actually that the 3 lines actually evolve differently in different time periods, and this bar chart hones in on that, showing decade differences. So in the 1980s, for both men and women, you see this kind of uniform increase, such that the higher the percentile of the wage distribution, the higher is the wage growth. When you go into the 1990s, that pattern carries on, both for men and women, but at a slightly more muted pace, not as fast as in the 1980s. Then when you get into the 2000s, actually you see that different patterns for men and women now. So inequality carries on going in, between 2000 and 2010 for men, but women actually do, you see the 10th percentile growing almost as fast as the other parts of the distribution. And then we enter this period of no wage growth in real terms from 2010 to 2019. And actually you see that, if anything, the bottom end is growing a little bit faster than the top end for both men and women, but even more so for women. So I will explore the reasons why. It's no big surprise what's going on. It's a really important effect of the minimum wage, and given more minimum wage workers are women, then of course they benefit more from the big increases in the minimum wage, which kept nominal wage growth above inflation, above price inflation. So here's a chart of GBR. The second bar to the second to the right here is Britain relative to other countries. This is showing you real wage growth over 2 time periods, and you can see that green dot between 2007 to 2019 is really low in Britain. There's been no real wage growth essentially at the average since then. The other side of the coin, employment and unemployment. So the employment picture looks much rosier, at least when you start to look at it. We had reached record levels in work if you look at the employed and the self-employed by 2019. with unemployment coming down and big compositional shifts in the nature of work between men and women, high education, low education groups, employed and self-employed. So the top chart here is the employment rate, which, as you can see, gets over 75% by 2019. The bottom line, which is sort of the mirror image of it, is the unemployment rate, actually, with 3 recessions featuring lower increases in unemployment on that chart. Okay, within this, there's been a big rise in self-employment, much, much more so than in other countries. And actually, all of the rise in self-employment comes from what we term the solo self-employed. So that's self-employed individuals who don't have any employees. So there's kind of 2 forms of self-employment out there. There's self-employed with employees, who we tend to think of as the kind of entrepreneurs, and as a solo self-employed, who often transitioned into solo self-employment from unemployment, who are working by themselves, own account workers. Since the global financial crisis, the rise, that big rise I showed you in aggregate employment, is very much driven by the rise in solo self-employment. So many of the new jobs, a disproportionate number relative to a share of the solo self-employed at the start, is driven by people going into solo self-employment. Now, rather worryingly, the income levels of the solo self-employed have fallen very, very significantly, and even more sharply than those numbers I showed you when real wages have stagnated for employees. So here's a chart showing you those 3 types, well, the 2 types of self-employment. The overall self-employment rate between 1980 and 2019 goes from under 10% to almost 15%. And it's all driven by the increase in that red line, which is the solo self-employed. The entrepreneurial class, the self-employed employees, actually falls quite significantly over this time period. If we think that that particular group are an important group for the dynamism of new firms in the economy, then that's a rather worrying trend that we see there. This chart just shows you how much of the post-global financial crisis increase in employment is to do with the solo self-employed, and you can see what a big chunk of it is, the red bar being the solo self-employed. This shows you the incomes of the solo self-employed, indexed to 1 in 2006, and so you can see actually that their incomes from their self-employment positions have actually fallen very much in real terms. They fell by about 20% in real terms between 2006 and 2019. So they're not doing very well. They're not in very high-paid jobs. Many of these solo self-employed. Rob's already alluded to this, so I won't spend very long on it. The composition of hours has shifted a lot, and there's a big gender dimension in this. There used to be hardly any men working part-time, but there's now quite a significant proportion of low-paid men working part-time. For women, the hours have remained much more stable. And so, of course, when you convert this with these hours changes into total, say, weekly earnings or even annual earnings, then, of course, the fall in hours is an important aspect of what's going on. So this is just 2 charts showing that. The green lines are the lower paid in the individuals. This is something else, returning to the solo self-employed. And many of the solo self-employed aren't working as many hours as they would like to. So that's another indicator that the quality of the jobs that they're doing are not quite what they would want. And this is also another reason, and this is the percentage you would like to work longer hours if they could, but they're not able to. So actually they're not being able to supply as many hours as they would actually like to as well. So these are kind of very much forms of insecure employment. You know, some of these are gig economy type jobs. Some are more conventional solo self-employed positions. The 40-year perspective, as I said before, has several dimensions to it. One is, of course, the fact that real wages have stagnated across the distribution, more or less. since the global financial crisis, or maybe a little bit before. It depends which data source you look at about when real wages start to slow down, but certainly since the global financial crisis. And this has come about for at least a couple of reasons. So one key one, which is explored in other parts of the Deaton review, is the fact that productivity growth has been really sluggish since the global financial crisis. And of course, given that productivity growth matters for wage growth, then that's a key factor underpinning what's happened. The big rise of solo self-employment has put downward pressure on real wages, and most in work have really not done well in this period of real wage stagnation. The exceptions are at the bottom end, which, as I'm going to come to in a minute, is due to labour market policy, and at the extreme top, who've done well. Everybody else has had pretty dire real wage growth in the last 10, 12 years. So just very quickly, this shows what's happened to productivity. This is taken from John Van Reenen's work in the Deaton Review as well. And you can see there's these two periods of productivity growth. That actually productivity growth was growing about 2.4% a year before 2007, and it's gone to almost zero since. And so, of course, this is a key factor. And for policy responses, of course, it's very important to try and think about how productivity can be improved. And of course, then you see that the mean pay, the pay of the average worker, or the pay of a typical worker, the median worker, has completely stagnated, and actually has not recovered even to the global financial crisis levels by 2019. Okay, so the economic models, I'm going to spend 1 second on. The economic models we have are quite successful in explaining a long-run structural rise in labour market inequality, and technological changes that were actually important for productivity and are complementary to skills and tasks have been important. So there's been an increased demand for skills, so that higher educated workers have been paid more and lower educated workers have been paid less in relative terms over time. And that's an important factor underpinning what's happened to the overall rise in inequality. There's been a polarization of work, such that jobs that are substitutable, often in the middle part of the distribution, have been lost because of the substitutability of new technologies, computers, robotics, and so on. And this has been coupled with an increased role for the relative strength of labour market institutions. Okay, so let me come to labour market institutions, and I'm going to talk about two quickly. The minimum wage, which came into the UK labour market in April 1999, and has subsequently been uprated a lot. And surprisingly to some, but not necessarily quite surprising to some of us who've worked on the economics of minimum wages, without having any bad implications for employment. So as the minimum wage has gone up, it hasn't cost jobs as many people predicted it would do before it came in. That just hasn't turned out to be the case. And there's very good economic reasons why that can be, and we can talk about those if people want to. On the other hand, the role of unions in collective bargaining has diminished very rapidly as unions have declined. Far fewer people are members of trade unions, far fewer workplaces recognise trade unions for collective bargaining purposes. And even within that, there's been a move away from more centralised bargaining to decentralised bargaining. So even when bargaining does take place with unions, it's much more at a decentralised level, which is harder to think about how you can actually bargain for above inflation pay rises relative to if it's at the industry level or the national level. So these have been pulling in different directions, these two labour market institutions. Union decline has been connected to rising wage inequality. So as unions have, we know unions confer a wage differential on workers relative to non-union workers. And actually, the fact that far fewer people are members of trade unions means that union wage differential is not being paid to as many workers. And so therefore, wage inequality has gone up. There's been big effects, and I mean very big effects, in the period of slow productivity growth and real wage stagnation of the minimum wage. Okay, so let's give a little bit more detail on this. Here's an interesting figure, which shows you on the y-axis the proportion or the percentage of workers who in these countries who are covered by collective bargaining contracts, and the x-axis is the minimum wage as a proportion or percentage of the median. So the higher that is, the tougher, if you like, is the minimum wage minimum wage policy in a particular country. So the UK has moved from not having a minimum wage back in 1980. It's, strictly speaking, that's not quite true. There was the wages councils, but they didn't cover many sectors. Only about 10%, 12% of the workforce were covered by sectoral minimum wages. But there wasn't a national minimum wage. The national minimum wage was introduced in 1999. The same was true in Germany, which introduced their minimum wage much more recently in 2015. But you can see that the UK has gone from the upper left quadrant to the bottom right quadrant over time. So it's going from a higher collective bargaining coverage country to a higher minimum wage country, and actually quite high in international terms by now. Another interesting observation, which we'll talk about, isn't about today, but the United States is the only country that's down in that bottom left quadrant with very weak minimum wages and very weak unionization. Of course, they are the highest wage inequality country amongst all of these, of all these countries on these charts. Okay, so just say a bit about what's happened to minimum wage. So this is just that chart that I showed before, now running from 1999. This is real wages, real wage growth at the 10th, 15th, and 90th percentile, same as before, for the red, yellow, and green lines. And there's the minimum wage. There's the minimum wage growth since 1999. So you can see the minimum. If somebody were paid on the minimum wage through all of those years, they would have experienced a lot more real wage growth than people at higher points in the wage distribution. Just to show the actual impacts that it's had here, the numbers at the bottom here are in 2000, 2010, and 2019, the 50-10 wage ratio. So back in 2000, somebody at the 50th percentile, the typical worker, was paid 1.8 times as much as somebody on the 10th percentile. You can see that from 2000 to 2010, which remember is a period when real wages were growing, the minimum wage helped out people more at the 10th percentile than the 50th. And so the 50-10 narrowed a little bit then, a modest increase, I guess, 0.1. Going down from 1.8 to 1.7. But between 2010 and 2019, when everybody else's real wages are not growing at all and have stagnated, the minimum wages had a huge effect. So the 50-10 actually dropped from 1.7 to 1.47, which for a 9-year change in an inequality index like that is a massive, massive fall. And so the minimum wage seems to have very strongly reduced lower tail, bottom half inequality. Top half hasn't changed very much at all. The 90-50 carried on going up between 2000 and 2010 and fell a little bit, going back to 2000 levels. Prior to this, remember, 90-50 between 1980 and 2000 went up hugely. And so it's sort of plateaued out by the time we get to 2019, but it's still a lot higher than it was back in 1980, which is the first observation I made in the talk. Unions and collective bargaining. Well, here's a chart showing that there's been big union decline in Britain. There's been big union decline in many places, but there's been very big union decline in Britain. The diamond is the 2018 percentage of the workforce who are union members, which is around about 25% now, whereas it was almost 60. Just over 50 back in 1980, depends which numbers you look at. It is true that union decline accounts for some of the rise. I already mentioned about the union wage differential. It actually only applies to male wage inequality because traditionally far fewer women were members of trade unions. And so union decline is less sharp than it has been for men. Okay, so let me just conclude with just raising a few policy areas. I know there's going to be more discussion of this soon, but it seems to be a large number of policy areas there was several policy areas that need to be thought about. It seems like only the minimum wage has actually been the real lever, a policy tool that's enabled leveraging of real wage growth. And we need to think about how wages growth can come about at higher up the distribution, especially given the stagnation that's occurred over the last years. The rise of insecure work means that provision of good quality jobs is an important aspect. Getting the minimum wage design right, such that it still carries on having beneficial effects, it's got to quite high levels now, is actually very important as well. The role of collective bargaining, contract regulation, and by the contract regulation here, I mean the fact that we've now got this increased haziness between employment and self-employment, and a sort of hinterland of people who are classified as self-employed, but it's not so obvious whether that's right or not. And of course, there's tax differences between the employed and the self-employed as well, which contribute to this. And so I think there's a need for thinking about contract regulation, both for employees, for example, on zero-hour contracts, also for these people in this sort of hinterland between employment and self-employment. You know, for example, quite a lot of people working for temp help agencies are classified as self-employed, which means, of course, they're not covered by the minimum wage, don't receive other benefits that workers do, pensions, sick pay, etc. And then there's the policy response to big shocks. We've got the global financial crisis. You'll notice here, we stop in 2019 in this chapter, and so we don't go into the shocks that have resulted from COVID. And there's also Brexit to be dealing with. So just to summarize and conclude, what we try to do in this chapter is document what's happened into labour market inequality. And so in that, wage inequality has increased in the past 40 years, but very much in distinct phases that are different in different dimensions, both in terms of unevenness and uniformity I spoke about, also in terms of whether you want to look at variance of hourly wages, weekly wages, to define inequality as well. It's also true that inequality has gone up by more than in most international comparators, and there's been this big moderation in the lower tail from the minimum wage in the weak real wage growth time period. The nature of work has changed, and I think some aspects of past researchers and policymakers by, especially given, you know, we don't have brilliant data on some of these alternative work arrangements. And I think people have missed the fact that there's been a big rise of work that has poor prospects of wage progression and career advancement, in that for solo self-employed, but also in other forms of alternative work arrangements and insecure work that have entered the labour market as well. Okay, so then you can read in our chapter what we talk about on some of the policy discussions, but the call for decent jobs and inclusive wage growth seems to have come to the fore. And in that, the response to economic shocks is going to be an important feature of what's coming. And so that's the kind of message, and we need to be trying to think about how we can get back to real wage growth to improve living standards and improve the productivity of the economy as well, is the kind of key point we want to get over in this part of the review. Okay, so I'll conclude there, and I'll hand over to Kate, who's coming next. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you. You're on mute, Kate.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great, thanks so much. So thanks very much for having me today. And I also just wanted to say a big thanks to Rob and Steve for all the kind of amazing work that has gone into these chapters, which are a huge resource for anyone who's interested in these issues, and just, yeah, incredibly helpful for us to think about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we think labour market inequality matters, and then most importantly, I'm going to talk about what I think we might be able to do about it. Just before I start, today the International Trade Union Movement is holding a day of solidarity with people in Ukraine. And so if you want to support that, you can donate to the ITUC's fund, which is going directly to supporting trade unions both in Ukraine and supporting refugees in the border. So just to kick off, I think, you know, Steve and Rob have told us many of the ways why labour market inequality matters. And even if we only thought this matters because of inequality of income, that would still be a really important reason for us to address it. But I think it's also important to note that work is often our access to many other forms of security. And one of the ways this has really come to the fore during the pandemic, which I thought might just be worth highlighting, is just the way that work and the quality of your work and the amount you're paid has had critical impacts on your health. So this chart, which might be a little bit difficult to see, tells you whether you get access to sick pay. The yellow bars are full pay if you're off sick as normal. The kind of dark pink bars are you don't get anything at all. And basically, I just think this is quite a kind of evocative way of showing how important labour market inequalities are. So you can see that if you earn over 50k, you're very likely to be getting your full pay if you're off sick. If you earn less than 15k, you're extremely unlikely to be getting your full pay off if you're off sick, and about 20% of people there not getting any pay at all if they have to take time off work when sick. And you can see that over the past 2 years, that's had really critical implications, both for your health at work, for your security at work, but also, of course, for your mental health and the level of anxiety you face if you are being asked to take time off work, if you're worried about falling sick. And I think, it's also a way of demonstrating how these kind of inequalities get replicated throughout the life course and kind of reinforce each other. So Steve was talking about the rise of insecure forms of work. Nearly 70% of insecure workers don't receive anything when they're off sick. You can see in the chart that if you're a Black worker, you're much less likely to receive full sick pay. And again, we see that Black women are twice as likely to be on 0 hours contracts, one of the most prevalent forms of insecurity, as white men. So again, a way in which these inequalities get reinforced throughout the life course. And at the moment, you've probably seen there's a lot of debate about older workers leaving the labour market as they get older. And again, these kind of inequalities get reinforced. So those in what are called elementary jobs, when you look at occupational classifications, but basically low paid jobs, are 4 times more likely to leave work after the age of 50 because of ill health than those who are professionals. And so these labour market inequalities, which Rob and Steve have described to us, have huge impacts on your income, and we all know that implications of income for your life chances, but impacts on your health and your sense of security in the labour market and in your wider life as well. Just a bit of kind of qualitative evidence on why this matters as well. These are from the USDAW members survey in 2021, USDAW representing mostly low-paid shop workers and people working in distribution. And this is just some quotes from their survey. So the first one giving you the kind of impacts of what it feels like when you can't take time off work because you're sick, workers who will not take the time off needed now because of the loss of earnings, and they can't be afforded to be off, and then they'll make other people unwell. So those effects have kind of ripple effects throughout the whole workforce. Second quote just tells you a little bit about the feeling of being in those kind of insecure work. And there's new research out from the Living Wage Foundation out today saying 1/3 of people get a less than a week's notice of their shifts. So you're always worrying about whether you'll be able to get enough hours to make ends meet. And the third quote, pretty common experience for lots of people at the moment. Today, we've just seen the biggest fall in real wages since 2014, I think, in today's labour market stats, but this kind of common feeling of even when my pay does go up, I'm still worse off. And this is just a kind of description of what we all know has been the longest pay squeeze in a generation. So that's why it matters. But what I wanted to concentrate on is what I think is a really kind of positive message from coming out from Steve's work, Rob's work, which is that policy actually works. We can actually do things about this. And Steve was talking about the impact of the minimum wage and showed that very clearly, and that we decided to put a floor under the wages of the lowest paid, and that raised workers' wages. But the quotes I've put up here are just to show that that wasn't always an obvious thing. I think we now, the minimum wage has been around for over 20 years. It's seen as a kind of, okay, this is a normal policy tool, but it was incredibly controversial at the time. So this is from an Institute for Government report saying that the Conservative Party in the 92 election ran on a kind of idea that the minimum wage was going to destroy 2 million jobs. The CBI was arguing in the late 90s that a minimum wage would reduce job opportunities and create major problems. Many people were saying, no, we actually need a wage floor. We can intervene in policy to tackle low wages. And the evidence of the last 20 years is, yes, we can do that. And it did have an effect. And I guess the kind of message I take from that is there are other things we could do. There are other forms of policy which we could do to actually tackle labour market inequality. Steve talked about the role of collective bargaining and obviously working for the trade union movement. I think that's the critical institution we have to tackle wage inequality. We know that when collective bargaining is in place, particularly across sectors, it reduces wage inequality within firms and it reduces wage inequality across whole sectors. So just on the left, I've put some research from the OECD. This is a report they put out in 2019, which looked at the impact of collective bargaining right across the OECD, basically. Pretty comprehensive research. And they were saying that collective bargaining is the most effective way to deliver wage inequality, to tackle wage inequality in a changing world of work, and it's most effective when it's delivered across whole sectors. So when you allow trade unions to set a minimum floor across the whole sector of the economy. On the right is from the Government of New Zealand website to show that this is a government which is actually taking this into account. So this isn't just a kind of relic of, some past time, but in modern labour markets in New Zealand, they are introducing the right for trade unions and employers to negotiate fair pay agreements across whole sectors. And as they say, for too long, New Zealanders working in critical roles like cleaners, supermarket workers and bus drivers have been undervalued. Fair pay agreements are about turning that round. So not only do we have the evidence to know this works, we have a positive example of where this is being put into place. Steve also talked about the role of labour market regulation in delivering fairer contracts and the rise of insecure work and the failure of our labour market regulation to adapt to that. And again, we are seeing policy innovation here. So Steve talked about full self-employment. Spain's just introduced what's called the Ley de Riders, which basically presumes that riders and people who are often in this kind of full self-employment situation presumes that they are employees. And this is a reform we've called for in the UK, a presumption of employment with the onus not on the worker to take their employer to court to prove that they are actually an employee. We saw that in the case of Uber, where those workers were able to demonstrate that, but only for them, no assumption that that would apply right across the sector. In Spain, they've said, okay, you have the assumption that you're employed and your employer has to prove that actually that's not the case. Again, the rise of zero-hours contracts has been one of the most kind of evident forms of that kind of low-paid insecurity that Steve talked about. But here again, we have seen policy innovation. So Ireland banned zero-hours contracts in 2018 in most situations. There's a few situations where you can use them for casual work. And most importantly, I think it introduced payments for cancelled shifts. And again, this is a reform that's been called for in the UK. The Low Pay Commission recommended in 2018, I think, that the government introduced a minimum notice period for shifts and payment when your shifts are cancelled as a way of pushing the costs of that insecurity back onto the employer and off the employee. And again, we've seen that this is a reform that has been implemented, can be implemented. The government has actually promised us an employment bill, but not yet delivered it. But again, we have the tools to tackle the kind of problems that Steve's talked about. We just need the will to implement them. I think this is basically my last point. We also need to look at things, bad policy we could avoid as well. And I think it's really important to note that over the past decade, I think there's a line somewhere in kind of Steve's full report where it says government doesn't actually have that many tools to tackle kind of pay at the median. But I think we can actually see the kind of tools operating in reverse, if you see what I mean. Bad policy over the last decade has helped deliver us to the situation we're in. So this is a fact that I think probably everyone listening to this will now know. We are in the worst pay squeeze since the Napoleonic Wars. And of course, that's linked to productivity. But there's been a huge amount of policy change during that period. So we had a long period of austerity. We had a deliberate attempt to shrink the size of state spending. And our argument is that that impacted on the willingness of businesses to invest. That's impacted on our productivity, and that's led to the weak pay growth. And that was a policy choice that government took, with, I think, very real impacts on our ability to deliver broad-based pay growth over this period. We also, over that period, had a big public sector pay squeeze or a freeze for the majority of that period. So again, a direct government intervention reducing the rate of pay growth in the economy that obviously not only affects those public sector workers, but has some impact more broadly in kind of setting norms for our expected pay growth. Again, a policy choice which directly reduced our pay. We had the sharp cuts to social security that Rob talked about a little bit in his presentation, not only reducing household incomes and kind of mitigating it against the effects of the positive employment growth we saw in that period in terms of reducing household income inequality, but also potentially I think there's some good evidence showing that a higher and more generous rate of social security gives people a little bit more of kind of options in order to choose better quality work. And of course, we've actually seen not measures to increase trade union power and to increase workers' bargaining power, but a series of anti-trade union laws. So the Trade Union Act was introduced in 2016, making it much harder for unions and for working people that they represent to actually take action to defend their jobs and their rights, introducing new thresholds for taking strike action in the public sector, new regulations basically tying unions up in vast quantities of red tape when they want to take action. So over the past decade, it's not just that we've seen this kind of pay squeeze as a result of complex economic factors that, you know, we definitely need to understand, but we've also seen deliberate policy choices which have reduced the power of workers over this period. And I guess what I hope this kind of amazing piece of research is going to give us some confidence to do is to think we could take different policy choices and we could actually tackle the pay inequality that is affecting working people across the UK and elsewhere. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to Richard.
Thanks, Kate. That was really wonderful. Let me just get that working. Great. Yeah, thank you very much. That was great. It added to a remarkable set of contributions that are coming out as part of this part of the Deaton Review on labour markets and inequality. And I just want to kind of take you through that a little bit and then raise some of the challenges and think briefly about some of the policy implications before we go to the Q&A. It's a really remarkable set of contributions to add to those already published so far as part of the review on trade, gender, firms, ethics, geography, and across a whole wide range of areas that all interact. And to really get a good idea of what's going on with inequality generally, you really need to put all these together. And that was becoming clear as we went through the discussion just now. The other, I've always thought really here that labour market inequalities are really the key ones in driving many other inequalities, whether they be health, gender, ethnic, gender inequalities, geography, set of inequalities. And so we really need to understand what's going on in the labour market, and therefore labour market policies are going to be absolutely key here. You've already heard from Steve and Julia, thanks very much for that. I'll come back to a little bit on the takeaways and also from Rob and the empirical background. I think one thing we've learned from this is evidence is really key in driving views about the labour market. Think of the change in view about the role of minimum wages and the impact of evidence on that. And there's plenty more of that can really stimulate the way we think about how to respond to some of these inequalities. If I take you through, even in this area of labour markets inequalities, there's plenty more contributions that we're publishing today. So look out, it's all live on the Deaton Review website, which I put up there at the top. There's a couple of things though that I wanted to highlight. I won't go into the detail, but wanted to highlight because they play such a role in interacting with some of this discussion. First is the role in labour market competition, unfair competition if you want, and monopsony. And there's a great piece that came out this morning as well by Alan Manning and Barbara Petrongo, looking at new evidence of the role of monopsony and labour market competition in the UK, and thinking about how we define local labour markets. The key idea there is that you have to think about how labour markets interact. And what they show is there's a good deal of room for a lot of monopsony action here in the UK. But another thing they point to is that if you just look at what's happened over the last 20 years, it doesn't seem to be a huge change in the role of labour market competition itself. It could be that that interacts with new technologies, platform technologies, and new world of work, and then creates this additional downward pressure on wages. But monopsony alone, I suspect, is not going to be the key driver of what's changed over time. But it also tells us that the impact of minimum wages that we've seen is right there for us to see in the way labour market competition is operating. With monopsony, of course, if you raise the minimum wage, you're going to have negligible impacts on employment, even potentially improved employment. And so that's a key piece there for us to think about empirically in the UK. Looking at the US, which is not always a great place to look at as far as what's going on in the UK is concerned. Nonetheless, the US, as Steve said, is at the top of the pile when it comes to labour market inequality and other aspects of labour market diversity in the labour market, if you want. And we might always worry that that's where we're heading. And so looking at what Ollie has written here on the role of public policy in controlling, if you want, or examining or regulating labour market competition. And he looks at the prevalence of non-compete clause, of non-poaching clauses in the employment contracts used by franchises right across the US. And there's no doubt that we need to be concerned about restrictions on opportunities of workers to move around employees. And that's something we'll come back to a little bit as I go through some of the policy implications. Kate mentioned the role of collective bargaining, and David Howe and Arnie Kallenberg have, pushed that. They push that as far as they can, and they take a role, a political economy perspective, that in fact, much of what we see in the labour market, both at the top and the bottom, is driven by collective bargaining. And to some extent, they've just got to be true. Some of the ability to acquire and take those rents at the top and not to take them perhaps at the bottom is a key reason behind the growing inequality. And I want to come back to that a bit when we come to policy implications too. Of course, the review is taking a comparative look across the whole of Europe and North America, kind of the developed economies of those two big regions. And we've spent a lot of time thinking about comparisons with what's going on in France, for example, and as you saw from Steve, what's been going on in Germany. And there's really a lot to learn there. That France is a high minimum wage economy, but the UK is heading there too. The real difference, I think, is in the way permanent and temporary contracts are organized, and the contracts that the inflexibility, if you want, of contracts there. And that's a really key comparison that we might want to think about. One of the absolutely main things that's happened, we think, in the labour market is the hollowing out in the middle of certain occupations. And that's really the key contribution or key idea that's coming from Daron and Pasquale's work here on task space. The tasks at the middle, in some sense, are being replaced by tasks, some tasks at the top and some tasks at the bottom. And as we saw, we're rather short of things to do to fix what's happening in the middle of the distribution as inequality has increased. And this is a key examination of how tasks work. And that's going to be very important in thinking about skills policy effectively to combat some of the inequalities that concern us. And then we've heard from Rob about the importance of looking at household earnings as well as household incomes and redistributive policy. I'll come back to that. This is very closely related to many other themes in the review. As I said, gender, race, ethnicity, and geography. There's just a whole lot of aspects that interact with the labour market. And that's just to make you aware that there's a lot going on here. And it's a really exciting set of studies. Some takeaways here. We saw a few of the kind of reversals, the lower tail picking up due to the minimum wage largely. But nonetheless, the UK labour market is now in a very challenging position with low productivity growth, stagnant real earnings, and high levels of inequality. There's been dramatic changes in the structure of the work. Some, you might say, are less good, some are good. We've seen the rise in the sort of self-employment and 0 hours contracts, fall in manufacturing employment and growth in the services, growth in immigration, decline in unions, and growth in the minimum wage. Of course, we've also seen a large rise in the proportion with higher education, a somewhat successful policy, at least up to a point where we've seen hardly any fallback in the education premium, at least until recently. We've also seen more women in work and the minimum wage both affecting them and also higher levels of education, putting women in a relatively better position in work. But in a sense, what we've learned from these studies is that it's changes in technology in the world of work that are really central to understanding the change in labour market inequalities. The rapid growth in employment in occupations at the bottom and the top is the kind of key thing we've seen, with a hollowing out of occupations in the middle. One thing that I've been particularly concerned of is the low rates of training and little overall earnings progression for low educated workers, and the fact that employment now alone is no longer enough to escape poverty. That's really changed the way we think of welfare to work policies. At one time, we used to imagine that if we could get people into work, they could earn their way into better careers and better earnings. That's turned out to be much less the case than we might have hoped. And really that focuses where we're going to have to work, and that is on thinking about how to generate earnings growth and career progression. If we look at the last 20 years, the cohorts have seen hardly any growth, at least at the median, in their earnings. It's been very depressing at the bottom of the labour market. In fact, in my time as a labour economist, one of the most depressing facts to have uncovered is the real low progression of low educated workers. And I think that's a feature that now is going to be highlighted as we move forward. Other things we've seen, though, are these extreme geographic differences in occupational composition and labour market opportunities, with low levels of education qualification in certain areas, and then education flight of the higher educated. There's the new rise in new forms of work outside the traditional employment contracts, and you know, we see different contractual arrangements facing different effective tax rates and not covered by certain rights, holiday pay, unfair dismissal, and what have you. And then there's a decline in unionization. All of this, to me, points a focus on real interests, real earnings growth, and the importance of generation of good jobs with career opportunities. So let me just finish with that. If I go back to where Steve and Rob started in a way, despite their success of the minimum wage and in-work benefits, in-work transfers, tax credits, and minimum wages, we really can't rely solely on these. In-work transfers clearly can offset the disincentives of means testing. They can encourage employment if they're well designed. They're well targeted typically to low earning families, but they do little for pay or for pay progression, which to me is the key, at least in the middle. Minimum wages raise hourly wages, and they've been incredibly effective at that, but they're less well targeted to poor families, and they provide little incentive, no incentive perhaps, for wage progression. And I think rather than a substitute, as they've been seen, I think, in policy in the UK, they're better viewed as a complement to in-work transfers. So I think we've got to move on to policies that focus now on the middle, on wage progression. And there we're back to human capital, training and technology. And we do know what could work, and we need to know more about that. Perhaps a focus on firm-based and accredited training, routes that are well organized, transparent, and allow workers to take qualifications with them. In some work across studies, across countries in the Deaton Review, we found countries that have more formal, transparent and organized routes to qualifications other than just through university have much lower inequality, at least in the middle of the distribution. And this is pointing to the importance of vocational training and rethinking training that can focus on career progression and complement new technologies. This is a good jobs, good firms agenda, and we're making progress there, but that's, in my view, where we have to go. And we need to think again, as Steve pointed out so clearly, on how solo self-employment and new forms of work work out. In particular, lining up benefit eligibility, access to training, and effective tax rates, not making one particular advantage over the other for no other good reason. There's a view too that we should probably be monitoring labour market power of firms and examining policies that could improve outside opportunities of workers in those new forms of work. I should add, the importance of place-based policies here. Much of the disadvantage is concentrated in particular areas, and we know that to get good jobs and good career progression in those areas is complex. You need both the right kind of skills, the right kind of workers, but also the right kind of firms and policies that are essential for agglomeration and reverse educational flight. Just to end on what changes after COVID, the challenges, I think there's a lot of challenges here. We know there's a large loss of skill investments among the young who have been in school and in workers, especially among low SES groups, low socioeconomic status groups. And together with the increased demand for e-commerce and IT, this will likely enhance inequalities. But of course, we might hope that there'll be a new emphasis on building a fairer society after the pandemic and a rethink of human capital policies and redistribution. After all, we did a lot of this during the pandemic. Much of it was temporary, but much of it was quite successful. But of course, we need to think this through with the challenge of mounting public debt. So on that very happy note, I will finish here and turn over to Paul to go to the Q&A.
Well, thanks ever so much, Richard, Kate, Steve, and Rob. We've got 20 minutes now for Q&A. Actually, we've got a bunch of really good questions in the slide. I don't think we're going to be able to get through all of them, but the top two are actually very closely related, and they're about self-employment. One of them, particularly, I think an interesting question, which I think we don't know the answer to, but I'm going to ask anyway, which is, do we have any sense of the extent to which minimum wage itself has actually impacted in the growth in solo self-employment and the gig economy and so on? Are people being pushed into these other forms of employment by the existence of the minimum wage? And related to that, given that we've got this big rise in self-employment, are there any policy measures that we can put in place to support that group of workers? I suspect everyone has got something to say about that. But Kate, why don't you start on those, and then I'll go to the other three panel members.
Thanks, Paul. That is a great question. I don't know the extent of the research on whether the minimum wage has pushed people into self-employment, but I suppose my argument would be is if the minimum wage was intended to push up wages and we want people to have higher wages, then we need to also make sure that we should counteract that effect, if you see what I mean. It's not a reason for minimum wages not to go higher. In terms of what the policy solutions to the rise of solo self-employment might be, I think we do need to distinguish between those who wanted to go into self-employment, are there on their own account, and those who've been pushed into forms of forced self-employment. As I said, we think one thing we could do is a presumption of employment for everybody who, a presumption of employment, so that employers are those who have to say, okay, we think you really are self-employed, and we think that would have a significant difference. I think it is worth looking at the tax system. I think the thing we would say is that the wage for employers is far higher than the wage for employees. So the difference, if you take somebody on a self-employed basis or take them on as a regular employee as an employer is 13.8%. As an employee, it's a 2% difference. So if we wanted to start with where do we start looking at incentives in the tax system, it's the incentives for the employer that I think are driving behaviour. So I think there's a lot we could do there. There is then, of course, people who are genuinely self-employed who want to be self-employed, and again there's more we could do to support them, and we could give them access to sick pay for a start. We could give them access to maternity and paternity benefits. For fathers in particular who are self-employed, there's no equivalent to maternity allowance. That would be a relatively easy, cheap thing we could start to do to give those workers some more security.
Who'd like to go next? Steve.
I can go. Yeah. So we don't have much evidence on. I'm a bit surprised we don't have much evidence on it, because it's actually relatively straightforward to do. On as the minimum wage goes up, does that change people's employment status? But what we do, I mean, what we do know, I'm not sure that it's going to be very important, because what we do know is that most of the transitions into solo self-employment are more likely to come from unemployment than from another form than from employment. And so what you need to be seeing, if it's relabeling of employees as self-employed by temp help agencies or whatever, then you would expect to see a transition in from employment, because they would change. And so actually quite a lot of people who are transitioning into solo self-employment are coming in from unemployment or non-employment, and so that wouldn't be in line with that. We had a little bit of evidence on a paper I wrote with Nick Datta and Julia again in economic policy about zero-hour contracts, and when the national living wage came in, it does look like that the proportion on zero-hour contracts went up a little bit as well. But that's employees, of course, so they're still being paid the minimum wage. And so that's just probably pulling in people who were maybe paid a bit above. And we know that the ZHCs are, there's some sectors that have got a lot of zero-hour contracts. I mean, domiciliary care is a really big one, for example, and many workers in domiciliary care are on the minimum wage. And so there is a kind of big connection between zero-hour contracts and low pay, of course. I mean, I would reiterate what Kate said on the policy side about the zero-hour contracts. I mean, other countries have been doing stuff. It seems to be not much on the agenda here for the current government, but other countries have been doing stuff. And I think New Zealand did something similar actually. So New Zealand's got the fair wage stuff and the legislation about zero-hour contracts. South Africa as well, I think. And there's quite a few places that have determined to do some degree of action on that as well. Okay.
Rob, Richard, do you have anything to add, or if not, we can move to the next?
Just the importance of lining up tax incentives and eligibility to benefits as much as we can across these solo self-employment, and just seems it's so important way to think going forward. I've just been struck by just the low progression and low access to training of solo self-employed. Of course, as Steve said, they're coming from unemployment, so that's to some extent always going to be lower, but it's a really key difference. And even if people prefer that position, we have to be clear that they're clearly losing out on certain things that we do see with some employees. So I think it's an important thing to look at.
I'll come straight to you, Richard, with the next one, which is about the huge increase in numbers of university graduates, and what impact we know of. What do we know about the impact of that on the labour market, on the distribution of wages?
Yeah, I mean, it is one of the biggest increases and fastest in developed economies, but it's been happening in many other economies, I should say. One really interesting characteristic that you see in Steve's chapters too is that although the education premium was rising for a while, it then flattens for a 20-year period, actually. And in some sense, that's you might think of that, and I do, as quite a success. We've more than doubled the number of university graduates without kind of reducing the premium too much. In fact, it has fallen back a little bit recently. But it's done two great things. One is, of course, we have more educated women in the labour market than men coming through in new cohorts. And there's still a return to that education. So that's key, both for gender and for wages. I also think there's a more subtle thing going on here, and that is it's very important to have educated people in the labour market for everybody in the labour market, and that is to really attract good firms and good technologies and kind of frontier agglomeration effects. You need to have educated workers. The key thing is you also need to have the right skills with the non-university educated workers to get them to benefit from that. But I think, to me, that's where the positive thing could happen, is that if we can get the right skill match here, and I think we're learning what that could be, then this large increase in educated workers, higher educated university workers, could also benefit the whole economy, and including those that don't come through university route. But we certainly need to revise the way we think of the non-university routes a huge amount. And there we've got a lot to learn from Scandinavia and other parts of Europe.
Anything to add, Steve?
Not really. Other than just completely agree with the last point that Richard made. I mean, I suppose one other thing that, you know, I mean the way that we deal with tax credits is that, you know, we're very favourable towards physical capital and not very interested for human capital, whereas other countries do have systems where we have human capital. I mean, we've got the apprenticeship levy, which is sort of like a tax credit, human capital tax credit, but that's not very, you know, big in terms of numbers. So, you know, other countries, particularly, you know, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, are much more sophisticated in terms of their policy design there. And it's not surprising that their vocational education and training systems are much more effective in producing workers who are matched better to firms, and therefore productivity is high. I mean, it's an absolutely critical thing for boosting productivity, which of course is something we need to be doing.
Okay, let's move on to another question. Rob, there's a couple of questions here about the life cycle. It's all very well presenting what you presented and what Steve presented in snapshot, but is that telling us anything about what I suppose really matters, which is what's happening to inequality to people over their lifetime?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I mean, so of course, in general, the level of inequality is always lower if you look over people's whole lives and measure their circumstances than if you're taking everyone at a snapshot in time when everyone's at a different stage in life and looking at inequality in their circumstances in that moment, because of course, you know, people's circumstances do fluctuate. So that's certainly the case. And I mean, Richard's built what for a normal person would be half a career on this kind of, for him, it's only a tiny bit of his career, but, you know, Richard himself has looked at this, of course, in a lot of detail, you know, in the past. And you can do things like look, for example, at inequality in other things like consumption, which you might expect to be a little bit less blown around by temporary changes in incomes, because if people expect, you know, that the change in income is only temporary, they won't necessarily spend all of that. And you do see that, you know, consumption inequality tends to be a little bit lower and certainly to move around a little bit less than income inequality. However, to bring it back perhaps a bit more concretely to the issues at hand, we do know, if you're thinking about people on low wages, one of the, I think, most depressing things about the situation there is that those people really do tend to see very little progression. It's not like that's a set of people for whom, you know, a large fraction of them, when you look in 10 years' time, you're going to find that, oh, you know, that low wage job was just a stepping stone to something much better. And we kind of have hoped that would be the case when, for example, we were trying to use tax credits to nudge people into work. Part of the sort of high hopes of that was that would just be a stepping stone to something more, and that it would build more labour market attachment, more skills, more progression and better careers. And that doesn't tend to happen. So I think that's that slightly depressing fact is probably important to keep in view. You know, yes, the life cycle is very important, and, you know, we do a lot of work on that kind of thing, but we really do see a lot a lack of progression at the bottom. A lot of the differences between groups, between education groups, but also between genders in the labor market as well, they are about differences in the rates of progression. The gaps tend to start small between these groups and then get bigger.
Richard, anything to add from your half a career, as Rob puts it?
Rob described it great. I think it is very important though, because those the more skilled have steeper and longer, higher profiles of their wages. So they are going to look, inequality will look a little more, a little larger if you take people around their 40s in the labour market than earlier in their careers. And that's something important. It looks like that may also be increasing, the profiles partly through the hollowing out, but the profiles at the top are steep and they last longer. The profiles at the bottom are flat. And of course, families at the bottom can spend their whole working career as families receiving in-work benefits, which I think was something we never expected to see when the original tax credits were introduced. As Rob said, that the idea of step into work would then eventually lead you out of low earnings and away from the tax credit and benefit system. So I think that idea of self-sufficiency over the lifetime is something that has really evaporated, and I think it's a focus for policy. We just, that's a very, not having the hope of rising earnings in your career and perhaps across generations must be one of the most hopeless things and depressing things for a family or a person. So I think that, to me, is where we should put a huge amount of emphasis here.
There's a couple of questions here which I'm just going to say we're not answering in this event. There's something about geographical distribution of wages. We published something on that a couple of weeks ago, so please do look on the website for that. And on capital incomes, we're looking at that in a couple of weeks' time as we produce something on top incomes and the role of the tax system. Kate, there's a question here about unionization, and I think the focus of the question really is, have unions declined in the sectors that they were always in, or is the problem that the sectors that unions were in have declined? And I suppose the sort of the logical conclusion of the question is, what is the union movement doing about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's sort of the answer's a bit of both, basically. So yes, unions were traditionally strong in manufacturing, and manufacturing is obviously the form of employment that has declined most, and perhaps union growth has not been as fast as it could have been in the sectors that have been growing. So there are some sectors, retail is actually reasonably well unionized in some of the big supermarkets. Asda, who I was quoting earlier, has about 50% density, although not across the whole retail sector. That will be in some of the bigger supermarkets. And it's not just been the kind of industrial change in terms of what sectors are producing jobs, but the kind of changing nature of business. So fragmentation of businesses, smaller establishments, outsourcing of various functions, whether that's your cleaning or your IT system, has also made it harder to unionize, because it means if you have a collective bargaining agreement with one company, you don't necessarily have all of the workers covered by that. So there's obviously things we think we should change at a policy level to make it easier to change those things. But there are also kind of union innovations, investments going in. A lot of more work is going into kind of digital at the moment. I think the union movement would hold its hands up and say it was slow to adapt new digital forms of organising, and we spent much more time thinking about or talking about how is technology affecting the world of work than how can technology help us to build new forms of work organisation. And the TUC now has a digital lab. I think you are seeing kind of turns towards kind of organising in the trade union movement and thinking about kind of new forms of kind of power and influence, thinking about a bit of talk about kind of leverage at the moment. So thinking about if we have got companies in kind of long and complex supply chains as an increasingly, feature of our economy, how might you influence other companies in the supply chain when you're trying to bargain with companies in one particular sector. So I think there is kind of innovation going on within the union movement to think about how we've adjusted to a changing economy. But I think some of those changes have also taken place in some ways deliberately to reduce workers' power, and I would put outsourcing as one of those. And I think we do need a kind of regulatory response as well as an organising response from unions themselves, and those two things have to go hand in hand.
Well, we're very, very nearly out of time, but there's one big question I still want to ask. There's a couple of questions in the chat about the role of AI, and I suppose more broadly speaking, major technological change. Steve, do you want to? I mean, what's your view as to whether sort of whether big technological change, in particular AI, is going to have a big impact here, or whether this is part of the the normal change in the labour market that we've always seen?
And of course, I don't have a crystal ball here. I mean, many people seem to think they've got a crystal ball, and then they can either take a position when it's completely innocuous, or it's just going to be the worst thing ever. And I think we know from practically all the big episodes of technical change that we've seen in the past that it's probably in between of those. And actually, of course, some jobs do get lost, but they mostly tend to get reallocated into new jobs that are created. And so the net effect on employment has never been, in really big periods of technical change before, going right back to the Industrial Revolution, I guess, has never really caused huge amounts of job loss. And so I don't really see why AI or robotics or it should be any different. But of course, it could be. But normally these seem to, we get job creation and job destruction happening at the same time, because the new technologies are complementary to the new sorts of jobs that can be created. But of course, they're substitutable for the ones that are lost. But we've rarely seen really big episodes of unemployment following significant technological changes in the past. So it seems hard to think, unless you can come up with some very good argument as to why these new forms of technology are going to be different with respect to their impact on the labour market than before. So I don't really go with the shock horror. Oh, it's all going to be disastrous for things at all. Not because it might not be, but because it hasn't really happened in previous episodes before.
Well, we're out of time, and that's probably the most positive note we're going to manage in this hour and a half. So it's probably not a bad time to finish. I mean, an enormous amount of richness in those presentations, and even more in the in papers that are now published on the IFS Deaton website, and a lot more to come from the review. I mean, some of the insights from this, I think, have been extraordinary, and I think what's really interesting is I'm sure that some of them go against some people's inbuilt narrative of what's happening. And I think one of the things you said, Steve, was really this remarkable narrowing in the wage distribution and the bottom half of the wage distribution over the last 20 years, which in one sense is very positive because it's showing that people at the bottom moving up towards the middle. But I think in another politically and socially really important, which is you can also see it's the middle moving down towards the bottom, particularly because they've had such little pay growth. But there's a huge amount of richness in all of this. We on the Deaton panel will be bringing all of this together with all sorts of a huge amount of other work that some of which I've referred to over the next few months, and hopefully drawing some broader conclusions. Thank you everyone for listening to this. Thank you again to the Nuffield Foundation for their generous funding. Thank you particularly to Kate and to Steve for speaking at our event, and to Richard and Rob as members of the Deaton panel and here at the IFS. And as I said, I think the next one of these, which is relatively soon, will be on tax and top income. So do look out for that one. Thank you very much.